Join me as I look back on Savage, the first and the second game. Why do this? Because I feel like it. Before we delve into the wonders of Savage, I'll refer you to something that applies to most video game developers, namely RNG. In our day and time, there are countless games on the market, and while most of them go unnoticed, there are some that call extreme attention to themselves will otherwise manage to spark a lot of interest. Everyone can think of games that are widely known and despite their developers' best intentions turned out to be terrible games either because they had horrible gameplay mechanics, awkward controls, predictable storylines, imbalances and whatnot. Despite the high amount of resources that are put into creating a game, every now and then you see a developer create a game that just has awesome written all over it. These developers tend to gather crowds of fanboys like you wouldn't believe, and people start writing long essays on how great the game is and why. I don't tend to jump up and down nor support a developer that creates a great game. I have a much different philosophy I call the RNG approach to quality. It basically boils down to anyone can get lucky, which is the truth, and this applies incredibly well to the video game industry. Here's an example of a developer that gets it. When Blizzard created Warcraft 3: Reign of Chaos, the game had a lot of new mechanics, some of which were unbelievably imbalanced and caused much grief. These were later adjusted, and when time came for expansion for the game, they looked at what the game had boiled down to and made adjustments to that. At the time it was range/caster craft, and people did little else than spamming ranged and caster units. They understood this, and in the expansion they added anti-caster units to all 4 factions, on top of changing the mechanics of spellcaster units by giving them their own armor and damage type. They understood their game, they understood what was good about it, they get it. Now let's take a look at Savage. Savage 1 came out of nothing. There were no expectations because nothing had been delivered prior to it, and it was in a very rare and unique genre, so there was little it could be compared to. The game had a very simple to learn combat system that was hard to master. As a human you could either block or attack, and as a beast you could attack and or leap around. Furthermore, the game had 3 levels of tech with more upgrades than you would ever need to win a game. Everything pretty much had to be researched, so there were plenty of decisions to make, and while people who've been playing Savage 1 for years and years might point out to me that the game has 1 or 2 valid tech orders, which it might, I don't know, I haven't played Savage 1 in years, I'll point out that it still has options available that in one way or another are useful. Any balance issues that might exist can always be rebalanced. Savage 2 offers no options, no choice, nothing. You build an armory, then a monastery, then either siege or legionnaires. No upgrades, no strategic choices to be made from the commander's side, and no reason for the team and the commander to communicate because everything's a given. The most lacking part of the game, I'd say, was the lack of difference between your 3 combat units. One was just stronger/better than the others, and cost more. So if you could afford it, there was little to no reason in not picking the better units. And while I support the idea that a game like Savage should never become a matter of I'm playing your anti-class, you lose, it only makes sense that units would have their own identity. Keep in mind that varied speed, health, attack is not exactly having one's own identity. I'm not talking about the difference between a brown dog and a bigger brown dog, but the difference between a fish and an eagle. Some could argue that Savage 2 does this because of the different classes, but no, it does not. All units are so alike it's not even funny. They use the exact same combat rules, which means that fighting is pretty much the same no matter what class you're fighting against what class. They all have 1 or 2 ranged attacks, and if you exclude the scout's weapons, not even a single weapon in this game takes a little bit of skill to get any effect from it. Instant abilities? No, they could only be more identical if all classes had the exact same ability. Another amazing thing Savage 1 had was the economy. You used 1 resource to research weapons, build buildings, and 1 to buy units and items. Not only that, but you actually had to farm the resource with workers, which is the best way to handle economy, looking away from the economic balance issues, of course. Why? Because it allows people to actually harass the enemy's economy. Savage 2 has this completely wrong because resource farming is an on-off switch. You're either mining from gold mine or you're not. It doesn't matter if you attack a mine and you kill off 90% of its health, it's still mining at full capacity. In Savage 1, if you kill off 90% of the workers that are mining, your opponent will now be mining at 10% capacity, and your efforts will not be as useless. Savage 1 also had much more varied maps than Savage 2 could ever hope for. There were large, open areas that were ideal for shooting the shit out of other people, and there were very close quarter areas where ranged weapons were almost useless because you basically start off combat in melee with players. Not only does Savage 2 have the most similar maps you've ever seen, but they all play out the same way. Each team has 1 obvious mine they need to expand to, and when that's done, it's a mindless tug of war going back and forth between the nearest spawn locations. Try to deviate from the shortest path between your base and your opponents, and you've not only wasted time, but you'll also be killed off by frisky spawning players that pop out of nowhere without any warning. Congratulations, you just wasted a minute of your team's time not fighting to go around and make no significant difference. So where does that leave Savage 2 when you compare it to Savage 1? No varied map design, unlike Savage 1, virtually identical classes, terrible combat system, unlike Savage 1, terrible economic system, unlike Savage 1, no upgrades at all, unlike Savage 1, no real tech levels, unlike Savage 1, useless ranged weapons, unlike Savage 1. Savage 2 has basically taken every single thing that made Savage 1 great and converted it into something that's terribly worse. What's the conclusion? Apparently S2Games had no idea why their first game was successful or chose knowingly to create a game that's fundamentally flawed and inferior.